everyone. Good afternoon, depending on where you're watching from. Welcome to the latest Power BI User Group webinar. Today we have Daniel Otykier. He's here to talk about Tabular Editor. Now, before the webinar and before starting the presentation, I would like to say a few words. This is the last webinar of the external tools series. It's the third week in a row. We are closing the month with Tabular Editor. And I just wanted to thank everyone for the support, the participation we had. We have had many attendees to the webinars. We have had many questions in each webinar. So that was great from the community, and we hope we can keep this up in the next months. So to present today's webinar, it's myself as Alessandro as the host presenting these few slides, and Riccardo in the background as a producer. And our presenter today is Daniel, who is a principal architect at Capacity, which is a company based in Denmark. He's also a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. And of course, he's the author of Tabular Editor. And if I don't remember wrong, I watched this, I think, in a webinar a few months ago. He's also the guy who did the external tools bar in Power BI as a contributor. So I hope I remember this correctly and I didn't say something wrong, but that's another great achievement from him, another great contribution. We are hosting these on Teams live events. You can ask questions on the panel, on the Q&A panel on the right. Our user group, as usual, the slides that Daniel will present will be made available on the user group library. Our channels, you already know basically all the infos. We are active on LinkedIn for the announcements, for updates on our contents, especially for reminders regarding our events. So follow us if you want to stay up to date with all the activity that we do, all the webinars and so on. We have a YouTube channel where we post all our webinars. This one will be posted as well on the YouTube channel. We are uploading content that we produce, like the video pills made from our members. And there is also more content coming in the next weeks and months, of course. And we have a meetup group where you can follow our events. Now, if you are very fast, you can scan the QR codes, or you can just search for Power BI User Group Italy on these socials, and you will find us. The next webinars, we are currently working on it. We are planning the next few months of webinars. We hope to bring more international guests, but also we hope to bring more people from the community, especially from the Italian community. The tentative schedule, as you know, is every 2 Thursdays at 18:30 p.m. And we'll try to respect this, but it might change like it did in this month when we had 3 consecutive Thursdays. Our call for speakers, like I said, we are looking forward to having people from the community. You don't have to present, as you know, as we always said, complicated, very technical stuff. We are happy to have people to come for their first webinar just to explain stuff that maybe they learned by working and they want to share with the community. So if you want, we are also available to help you in supporting you and helping you with your first webinar. So just hit us up on our socials. Other events, the user group monthly meeting, which is, I think, a great event. We did, unfortunately, just one until today. It's a meeting where we meet in a Teams call, which is open to everyone. Everyone can come and we comment the latest. We comment the latest news on Power BI, the latest release. Unfortunately, we have not had new releases since November. We had December, but we decided to skip because Christmas and everything else. So we'll probably see you in March or late February if the new release comes. Other events, we also have the Power Platform Bootcamp, which is going to be tomorrow for the Italian tracks. You can still register, I think. And there will be 4 tracks in the Italian bootcamp with speakers from all over the world. And that's it. So thanks, everyone. I will now give the word to Daniel, and he will present Tabular Editor to you. Let me unshare my screen. Okay.
Okay. So thank you, Alessandro, for the introduction. Let me see if I get this set up correctly. I think you should be able to see my screen now. So yes, I will just jump right into it. This session, as Alessandro said, is about Tabular Editor. And so I will just start out with this slide, putting a few more words on what exactly is Tabular Editor. So Tabular Editor is this tool that I have been working on for the past almost 4 years. It's open source and available on GitHub, and basically it's an offline editor experience for SQL Server analysis services or Power BI tabular models. And so the reason I say analysis services is because analysis services, as many of you probably already know, is the engine running underneath the data model within Power BI Desktop. So when you're building a data model in Power BI Desktop, in reality you are actually building an analysis services tabular model, and that is why Tabular Editor can now also be used against this model, and I will come back to this point later on. When I started creating Tabular Editor, I created it basically just to make it easier for analysis services professionals to increase their productivity when they are creating tabular models for analysis services. During the last half year or so, since the release of the external tools integration for Tabular Editor, we have seen that now Power BI professionals are also starting to pick up Tabular Editor. The tool itself is a lightweight WinForms application written in C#. The download size is just 3 megabytes, so it's a very, very lightweight, small application that you just download and install. And it uses something called the Tabular Object Model, TOM, in order to browse and make changes to the model metadata. So TOM is actually an API provided by Microsoft, which makes it possible to make changes to the model metadata, so the tables, the columns, the hierarchies, and so on in the model in a programmatic fashion. And this API is very, very fast, since it only works with model metadata. So Tabular Editor doesn't load any of the actual data that you have inside the rows and columns of your tables. It only considers the model metadata. And so that is why you will see that making certain changes, like adding new measures, adding a calculation group, that kind of stuff, changing properties, hiding, showing columns, adding descriptions, and so on. All of these operations are very, very fast because all of these operations are done offline. So there is no database that has to be recalculated or anything like that. That only happens once you save the metadata back to analysis services, so back to Power BI Desktop in this case. So with this slide here, it's just saying that if you're using Power BI together with Tabular Editor, you can actually, in some cases, achieve an even better experience when you're building your Power BI models. Today, we have support for editing not everything, but some of the most important things, which are measures that we can delete, edit, add using Tabular Editor. Or any other external tools, actually. This is not just something that can be done using Tabular Editor, but thanks to this external tools integration in Power BI Desktop, which is the one that I helped create. Alessandro was right about that. Any external tool can actually use the tabular object model to make these kinds of changes to the model metadata. For now, though, I believe Tabular Editor is the only tool that has this sort of visual interface that shows you all of the measures of the model and lets you copy, paste, drag and drop, and all of that kind of stuff. But in theory, you could create your own tools to automate or make changes to the Power BI data model through this external tools integration. So the objects that are supported right now is measures, as I said, calculation groups, and in fact, external tools are the only way that you can add a calculation group to your Power BI model right now, since Power BI Desktop does not itself have any feature where you can add a new calculation group to your Power BI model. And I will show you later on in the demo what exactly a calculation group is, for those of you who don't know that. But basically, yeah, you can consume the calculation group within Power BI Desktop, but there's no way to create the calculation group. So you will have to use an external tool for that. And the same thing goes for perspectives, which is also something that we can only add through external tools, but it's fully supported in Power BI once you have the perspective in there. And also something called metadata translations. If you ever need to translate the metadata of the models, so the names of measures and columns and tables, into other languages, then you can actually use this feature of the external tool to apply these translations to your model. If you're using Tabular Editor against Power BI Premium or any Power BI dedicated capacity, then we actually have full support today for editing any model property. So in this case, if you're connecting to the Power BI Premium XMLA endpoint, so this is not against Power BI Desktop, but against the Power BI service directly, then we have full support for editing everything within the model. So anything that you can edit with external tools can be done through the XMLA endpoint. There's just one important thing, that right now you should be aware that it's not possible to download a PBIX file from the service after you have made changes to it using an external tool. So that's a very important note, that if you need to download the PBIX file again, then you should not edit it. And then you should probably keep the XMLA setting read-only. Someone is asking, why is there an asterisk near translation support? That's because right now there's, and I apologize that this isn't showing on the slide. I think it may be written in the slide notes, but right now there's a limitation if you apply a translation to the default culture of the model. What that means is that all models that you create, so here, for example, we have this AdventureWorks model that I've created. You can see that in the options for this model, there's a language setting. I believe it's somewhere around, here, the regional setting, which is sort of the default language for the model. So in this case, it's English. But this is typically determined based on what setting you have in here. So here you can see for the model language, this is a default language that gets applied. In my case, since I'm using the English version of Power BI, it will always apply English as a default language for new data models that I create. And right now in Power BI Desktop, there is a bug. If you add a translation to the same language that is the default language, then the user interface starts to behave in some weird ways where you're not always sure if you're seeing the translated name over here or if you're seeing the actual untranslated name. So if you're using it right now, metadata translations, you should be aware that you should only apply translations to languages that are not the default language of the model. So I'll show you an example of translations later on, but that is the explanation. But this is something that Microsoft is aware of, and it's going to be fixed hopefully in a few months. We will see an update to this where we no longer have this issue. Yeah, and also along the way, we expect that that over time, once the external tools integration comes into GA, we will see that this limitation of which objects we can edit using Tabular Editor will be this restriction will go away, so that we can use Tabular Editor or other external tools to edit any aspect of the modeling of the data model. So since it is still a preview feature, I recommend that you always keep a backup of your PBIX file before you start to make changes to it using Tabular Editor. So what are some of the reasons why we should use Tabular Editor? Well, in my opinion, the standard tools have some shortcomings. especially because, as I mentioned earlier, these tools, so SSDT is mostly for analysis services, Tabular developers, and then of course Power BI Desktop. But the thing about these tools is that they are always connected to the data model. So every time you make a change, for example, if you change the name of a measure, or if you change the format string or something like that, then the tool goes in and does a complete resynchronization of the database. And this operation could actually take quite a while to complete, especially if you're working on a large complex models with many tables and many measures. That's when you see the little working on it spinner in Power BI Desktop. And in my opinion, this is not an ideal situation for a developer. If you're writing a lot of DAX code and you're creating a complex model, then you want to have the ability to go back and forth and switch between measures all the time to make changes, copy and paste, and all of that stuff. And you don't like to wait a few seconds every time you make a change. These kinds of changes should be lightning fast. And then when you're ready to see the impact of the changes you make, you should just press one button. And then it's okay to wait a couple of seconds while things update to see the results. And so that is sort of the primary reason for using Tabular Editor instead, because this is exactly what Tabular Editor lets you do. It also has some other features that are nice for visualizing translations and perspectives and display folders in the model and so on, that some of the other tools, the standard tools, doesn't have. For Power BI Desktop, I don't think it's a problem with display folders, because Power BI Desktop always shows the display folders. But in SSDT, for example, all of the measures have to be maintained inside a grid, which looks like an Excel table. So you cannot see if any of the measures are inside a display folder. And so that's not, once again, a very good experience, in my opinion. Yeah, and then, as I said, the offline capability, the ability that you as the developer can control when the database gets synchronized. And then Tabular Editor also has a lot of other interesting features. For example, Tabular Editor has a scripting interface that lets you automate certain tasks, and I will show you a demo of that in a short while. Tabular Editor also has a best practice analyzer, and just recently, just a few weeks ago, one of the Microsoft employees on the Power BI CAT team wrote this blog post on using Tabular Editor's best practice analyzer with a Power BI model. So I think I can probably find a link to that and put it into the slides, so when you look at it later. But very interesting blog post with lots of best practice rules that they recommend that you download and use with Tabular Editor. And then also Tabular Editor has this save to folder functionality, which is useful if you're a developer in a large team of developers, and you often have the need to work multiple developers in parallel, so working simultaneously on the same model. Because save to folder is a way of taking all of the model metadata and splitting it up into smaller files so that it's easier to integrate the model metadata with version control. So for example, using Git or Subversion or something like that. This of course only works if you're not writing or if you're not using Power BI Desktop, because there's no way to take the PBIX, the entire PBIX file and put it into a version control like this. So this is more relevant for those of you using Power BI Premium or Power BI Dedicated Capacity, because in this case you can take the metadata from the folder structure and deploy it directly to the Power BI endpoint using Tabular Editor. So this is more for more enterprise-oriented development, where you have at least access to the Power BI Premium endpoint. So I see there's a couple of questions. I'm looking for a robust way to use a single data modeling tool and deploy to Power BI Service with Pro, Power BI Service with Premium, XML endpoint, SSAS 2016 plus on-premise. It seems no Power BI Desktop nor Visual Studio commands all targets at the same time. Can Tabular Editor help? Example, use desktop as model editor, open the model with Tabular Editor and deploy it to SAS on-premise. So, well, the answer is a little complicated because you can certainly create a model using Power BI Desktop, and then you can use Tabular Editor to make some modifications to the model in order to allow you to deploy it to SSAS on premises. But the thing is that SSAS on premises is you have many different versions of SSAS, of the analysis services engine. And the engine in Power BI Desktop is always the latest version of analysis services. So it could be that you are using some new feature, some new DAX function or something like that in Power BI Desktop, which doesn't exist in your SSAS on-premises instance, depending on what version you're using. Of course, if you're using the newest version of SQL Server 2019, then maybe it works. But if you're using an older version, then you may have some issues, and there might not be a straightforward migration path. It also depends on the compatibility level of the model. In general, Power BI Desktop uses a higher compatibility level, but you can certainly try and see if it works for you. But I'm afraid there's no guarantees that it will keep working if whenever there's a new release of Power BI Desktop. So the best workflow in this situation, if your target is always SSAS on premises, then I recommend that you always use Tabular Editor just for building the entire model, because that way you can make sure that you know exactly what compatibility level you're using and so on. So you always know the target that you're deploying to, and this way you have full control. So that's at least what most people who are building models for analysis services, they are only using Tabular Editor these days for building the model. Yeah, I think that was the questions for now. So a couple of things to note before you start using Tabular Editor. I would say that Tabular Editor is not a good tool if you are new to tabular modeling, because there's a lot of things that are sort of missing that doesn't really help you in order to learn how to build tabular models. So if you don't know what the difference is between a measure and a calculated table, well, then I would say you need to start using Power BI Desktop first until you get a good feel for working with the data. In the open source version of Tabular Editor, there's no diagram view, there's no DAX intelligence, no data preview or processing capabilities. And again, since it's an open source tool, there's no 24/7 support or anything like that. So my advice is, if you're new to tabular model development, use the standard tools first until you are familiar with some of the concepts. And then once your data model reaches a certain size and complexity, then you can switch over to Tabular Editor, and then you will certainly appreciate some of the things that Tabular Editor can do. Notice that I mentioned that this is for the open source version of Tabular Editor. I am actually working on releasing a brand new product, which is called Tabular Editor 3. Which is going to be a commercial product. And this product actually has some of the things on this slide. It has a diagram view, it has DAX intelligence and so on, but this is going to be a commercial product. So we'll leave this for another time. That's not what I'm going to focus on here. So there's a lot of features in the UI of Tabular Editor, but instead of going through all of these one by one, I think I will just jump right into the demo. So going over to my Windows machine, what I have here is just a very, very simple Power BI model where I imported some tables and allowed Power BI to create the relationships between the tables. It's just a simple AdventureWorks model. And then after you install Tabular Editor, you will notice that you get this little external tools ribbon up here, where you will see that the Tabular Editor appears. And now here, of course, I also have the new version I'm working on, but that's not the one I'm going to show you today. So here we just go ahead and click on the Tabular Editor button, and this will then launch the open source version of Tabular Editor. So here on the left side, you will see we have basically a visual representation of the tabular object model. So the model metadata, which starts at the model, and then you may have data sources, perspectives, relationships, and so on, and tables. And within each table, you can have measures. A table also has something called partitions, which is something that Power BI Desktop normally manages for you. And then, of course, you have all of the columns, and you can see here what the column format string and data types are, and so on. And you can also see that the name of the column is using a grayed out text in case the column has been hidden. So basically you get a quick overview of how the model is structured in here. And then you'll see what we can actually do once we start to edit the model. So the first thing I would like to point your attention to is that if you go to File and Preferences, you will see that here is a checkbox called Allow Unsupported Power BI Features. Now this is actually disabled by default, so when you install Tabular Editor, it's going to look like this. And this means that Tabular Editor will only allow you to make the changes that are supported according to this slide here. So right now it will only let you create measures, calculation groups, perspectives, and translations. But even though these are the features that we know are supported right now, it could be that sometimes you want to experiment a little bit and you want to see what else you can do. And so in that case, you put a check mark here, because then that will unlock everything, all tabular object modeling operations that are possible. So just to illustrate the difference, you can see that now when I have this disabled and I right click on a table, you can see that the only option I have here is to create a calculation group. The other two are grayed out because those are not really supported at the moment. But if you go in here and you put the little checkbox, then you will be allowed to make any kind of change to the model. So now you can see that all of the options are available. But please, if you do this, always make sure to keep a backup of the PBIX file, because if something breaks and you do something that is not supported, then Microsoft will not be able to help you. So that's just a little warning. But feel free to experiment with it once in a while. I'm getting a lot of feedback from people on GitHub that are doing amazing things where they're creating calculated tables and other stuff that Microsoft says are not really supported, but somehow it still works. So feel free to play around with it, but just keep in mind that it's on an experimental basis. So going back to things that we know are supported. So one of the first things I'd like to show you is how we can actually multi-select several measures at a time just by holding down Shift. And then we can change properties on these measures. For example, we can put these measures into a display folder. So we just go over here into the property grid and we type something like new display folder, and we hit enter, and now we have all of these measures collected into the same display folder. And we can make subfolders also if you like. So creating a new subfolder here. And then we can drag and drop measures around. So by multi-selecting, we can just drag and drop. And if we make a mistake at any point, we can just hit Control-Z to undo the change, and you can see everything gets back to the way it was. And we can also, of course, redo these changes. So you will see all of these changes happen lightning fast. You don't have to wait for anything while you're making these changes. We can also copy paste. So now I'm hitting Control-C to copy. And now I can paste these, and I can do this many times. So this way I get many measures. So we just put these into a new folder and call this copies. And then at some point when we are ready and we want to see the change in Power BI Desktop, that's when we hit the Save button. So we can go to File, Save, or we can hit Control-S. And when we do that, you'll see the little spinner, and then you see the field list over here is going to change to view the impact of this change we made. So if you have a model with many hundreds of tables and many hundreds of measures, then probably already at this point you can appreciate that this tool here can help you manage all of these objects and make it easier to navigate the model. Of course, you can also filter to quickly find if you're looking for something specific. You can also use the little buttons up here at the top of the screen to show or hide different kinds of objects. So if I'm not interested in columns and partitions, I can just get rid of those, and then Tabular Editor only shows me the measures within each table. So it's pretty easy to navigate through all of this. And now we have also seen how we can copy and paste. An interesting thing is that you can also copy and paste these objects between different instances of Tabular Editor. So let's say, for example, that you have another instance of Tabular Editor open and you're working on a different model. So perhaps I have here some other model, and this could be an analysis services model, for example, where I have some other measures going in. Well, then I can actually take these measures and I can just copy. So here I hit Control-C, and then I go over here and I hit Control-V, and then these measures show up. Now, of course, this only works if the DAX expression within each measure is valid. So we can try to hit Save, and then you can see we get these little warning icons here. And this is, of course, since Now I just copied some DAX expression from a completely unrelated model, and this model now has some. So now we have some DAX expressions here that are not valid in the model where I pasted this into. So let me just delete these again, and then we save one more time, and then we should no longer have any errors. Another thing you can do using Tabular Editor is if you want to see what is the relationship, the dependencies between the measures of your model. And now, since this is a very simple model, I'm going to use this one instead, since this one has more measures in it. And let's say, for example, I want to see if my internet total sales measure is being used by any other measures within my model. Well, then in that case, we have this show dependencies option where you just hit F3. And then it shows you this dependency diagram here, dependency tree, where we can now see that internet total sales is also being used by total sales, and by total sales, sales territory sliced by employee, and so on. And we can even see the downstream dependencies that these have all the way to the lastmost measure that is being used. We can also see in the opposite direction if we want to see if internet total sales depends on other measures. In this case, it doesn't, but it does depend on a column in this case, and this column in turn resides on this table. So this dependency thing can be viewed in both directions. What else for the UI features? Yeah, so we already saw display folders, how we can work with those, how we can multi-select, drag and drop, copy paste. Oh, yeah, if you, I mentioned translations earlier on. So if you want to add a translation to your Power BI model, what you have to do is you have to go in and add a new translation here. And this is when I said earlier about the default model culture. You should be aware that you should not apply translations to the default model culture. So even though this model now has one translation, which is English, we should not use this translation for changing any of the object names. So in other words, all of the names that these objects have should relate to the language that is the default model language. So if you're writing all your table names and column names in Italian, for example, then you should make sure that the default model culture, this one here, will be in Italian, and that's the setting that I showed you earlier on in here. But once you have that, if you want to add other languages to the model, you simply go in here and you add the new translation. So in this case, let me add Danish, which is my language. And then you can simply switch to that language up here in the dropdown. And then you can start to translate things just by typing a new name for each object. So customer is called Kunde, date is called dato, internet sales would be called internet sell, and so on and so forth. And so once you start to translate the objects, you can see what their translated names are going to look like. And of course, once you save these changes, it will not be visible in Power BI Desktop, because Power BI Desktop will only show you the default language of the model, which in this case is English. But if you decide to then publish this model to the Power BI service, and you have users that are connecting to the model using different locales, then these users would be able to see the model in different languages. So that's the idea of the metadata translations that you have here. So you can always switch between these translations and see what the model looks like in different languages. So I see there's a couple of questions. Probably one thing missing is the possibility to use the filter box to search text within DAX measures. Well, you can actually do that because the filter box up here supports a special syntax called dynamic link, which allows you to write an expression to search. And it's a little complicated, but I'll show you what the way it works. So instead of just typing the name of the object you need, what you're going to do in this case is you're going to type an expression which sort of evaluates to true or false. It's similar to how the best practice analyzer works if you use that. So in this case, you would type something like expression contains, and then if the word I'm looking for is profit, and then I hit the filter button. Oh, so that was no. Okay, let me type something else. Let me type sales. Yeah, so here we go. So now I'm just looking for objects whose expression contains the word sales. So I expect now that all of these, yeah, and here you can see all of the measures that we found here, all of these contain the word sales. So this way you can actually search within object expressions or any other object property. And if you're interested in this, I would recommend that you go and take a look at the documentation. So the documentation site is called docs.tabulareditor.com. And here is an article called Advanced Filtering, which explains a little bit more how you can use this syntax to search for any kind of object and object property. There was another question. One case I might think of is to find a certain column is referenced. Yeah, Alessandro, maybe you'd like to put some more.
Yeah, no, that was actually my answer to the previous question, because I didn't think you could search for the text inside the measure, so that's okay. Mind-blowing. I was just saying that I thought that one way you can use the search for text inside the measures is to see if you're using a certain column or a certain measure inside other measures. But to do that, you can already search for the specific measure instead of saying, instead of writing in the search box and then see the dependent objects. So that will give you the same result. But yeah, that's great that you can actually do it in a search.
Yeah. So let's say maybe you have put some comment here.
With comment, yes.
Then you can go here later on and say, okay, find those that contains the to-do comment, and then you will see this measure in the list right here. So maybe there's some use cases for that. But please go and take a look at the documentation if you're interested in this, because you can do this not just for searching within the expression, but basically for searching within any of the object properties here. So if you have descriptions or if you're looking for certain format strings or something like that, then you can also use it for that. All right, so the next thing I wanted to show you here is, I mentioned also in the introduction that we have this new thing called calculation groups, which is this new feature that Analysis Services team added to Analysis Services tabular models, but unfortunately Power BI Desktop does not have any interface which allows us to create a calculation group. But luckily we can use Tabular Editor for that. So we just right-click, create a new calculation group, and then the typical example of what we use a calculation group for is for time intelligence. So let's just call this one time intel. And just as an illustration, let me create a few items here, current, and we type the formula here, selected measure, and let's create another one called year to date, and write total year to date, selected measure, and then we have to use the date column here. Yeah, by the way, notice how I dragged the column over to the formula area, so it types the full name of the column, including the table qualifier. So that's also something you can do. Oh, and by the way, so I noticed, I mentioned earlier that there's no DAX intelligence or anything, but there is actually a few things that may be able to help you when you're writing DAX code. So for example, if we have the format DAX button here. So if you have a long, complex DAX expression, you just hit this button and then we'll format the DAX code. So it looks a little more pretty. But we also have this go to definition button here, fourth from the left. So if you hover over total year to date, and you press this button or you use the F12 keyword shortcut, then it'll actually open a browser and it will navigate to the DAX guide website that Marco Russo created, Marco and Alberto, with the definition of what this function does. So this is helpful if you forget what the syntax is for any of the DAX functions. If you do the same thing while you have the mouse cursor over a column or a measure reference, then Tabular Editor will just navigate to that object. And then you can use the little arrow buttons here on the right side of the screen to go back to the object you came from. So going back to calculation groups, now I've created these two calculation items, current and year to date. Let me create one more called month to date. And let me rename this total MTD. So, and then we just change the order of these. So I want to see, first I want to see current, and then year to date, and then month to date. So when I'm dragging these objects around, you can see that Tabular Editor will assign the ordinal value to each of them. So 0 for the first one, 1 for the second, and 2, and so on. So this is just for the display ordering when we are using the calculation group. So we hit save, and now Power BI should inform us that we have one or more calculation groups that needs to be manually refreshed. So we hit the refresh button. And now we have the time intel calculation group that shows up as if it's just a normal table inside of Power BI Desktop, and we can also go and see the data inside this table. So it just has these 3 members corresponding to the calculation items I created, and the ordinal column has been set up as the sort by of the name column. So you can see the name is now sorted by ordinal. So this just works the way any normal ordering uses. Basically what calculation groups does is it allows us to apply the calculation logic that we created on the calculation items and use this logic across all of the measures in the model. So instead of creating a year-to-date measure, so a copy of each measure that is year-to-date and another copy for month-to-date and so on, then we can just reuse this logic across all of the measures. And the way it works basically is that I just take this this new name column that we have. If we don't like it, we can actually rename that column to something else. So by default, I call it name, but we can also call it time aggregation or something like that. And then hit save. And then we see that the name also changes in here. And then we can drag it, for example, into the columns area of this matrix. And then you can see now we get this year-to-date aggregation for this measure that I have here, which is my internet sales amount. But the cool thing is that if I take a different measure, so if I use something like internet gross profit, then you can see that the aggregation still works. So this way you don't have to repeat all of the DAX logic for creating time intelligence logic for each of your measures. You can just put the measure logic into these calculation items. It's a pretty nice feature. And as you can see, it just works, but you have to use an external tool to create it. Yeah, I think this is what I want to show you for calculation groups. There's a lot of other things going on. I also would like to show you what the scripting functionality I mentioned earlier can do. So let's say, for example, that you are creating a new model and you just imported some tables from various data sources. And now typically the first thing you need to do is you need to create explicit measures. And why do we need explicit measures? Well, there are 2 reasons for that. For example, calculation groups like the one I just created will not work if your model does not have explicit measures. So you will have to create these measures on your model for calculation groups to work. But also, if you have anyone in your organization that wants to use Excel to analyze the report with Analyze in Excel, then they also need explicit measures to be available in the model. So that's always the first best practice that we have when we're building Power BI reports is to create explicit measures. And so, of course, if you just have a table like this with many different numeric columns, it can take a while. Of course, you can go in here and say create new measure and call this sum of discount amount. And then you go over here and type the DAX formula for summing the discount amount column. But of course, if you have 50 or so columns where you need to do this operation, then it still takes a lot of time to go over these columns one by one and creating measures for each of them. So instead of doing it manually this way, you can use this advanced scripting feature, which lets you type a C# script here to automate this process. And once again, I would recommend that you take a look at the documentation, because here you will find an article called Useful Script Snippets, which contains a lot of the sort of most commonly used scripts, which are very useful to get you started and also to learn the syntax of scripting. So the very first example we have here in this article is how to create measures from columns. And this is exactly what we wanted. So I'm just going to copy this snippet of code and paste it into the scripting window. And I'm not going to spend too much time going into the details of this. Instead, I'll just show you that if I now select a number of columns in my model, so for example, I will select the discount amount, extended amount, freight, order quantity, sales amount, and tax amount, and total product cost. and I then run the script, then you can see that Tabular Editor now generated 7 new measures just by clicking a single button here. And you can see how it set the expression of all of these measures to different values based on the name of the column. So basically what the script does is, based on the selection, it creates 1 new measure for each column that I selected, and then it applies a default format string and a default description, and also it hides the base column. But of course you can tweak this, you can change the naming, or you can use a different DAX function if that's what you need. So there are many ways you can modify this script to suit your needs. So yeah, it can be very useful for automating these kinds of things. There's also a different example here, which is more useful if you do not like to use the calculation group for creating time intelligence. So in this example, this is a little longer script, but basically what this script does is it adds a time intelligence version or a copy for each of the selected measures. For both year to date, previous year, year over year, and so on, various time calculations. So let me just try to run it. So now you can see now I've just in a few seconds I generated a ton of measures here, different flavors of the same base measures. And by hitting save, I can now see the measures over in Power BI Desktop. So just imagine how much time it would have taken you if you had to create all of these measures one by one over in Power BI Desktop. So yeah, if you ever find yourself in a situation where you need to repeat many similar operations of creating many similar measures like this, for example, then always consider that the scripting feature here might be able to help you to do it even faster. All right, so that was a little bit about the scripting. Next up is the best practice analyzer. So you'll see down here at the bottom of the screen, we have this thing where it says I have a number of best practice issues, and right now I have many, and that's because I have many measures in this model. So this here is going to provide a list of best practice rules that we should consider to do something about. Now, by default, when you first install Tabular Editor, you will not have any rules installed, but you can add a collection of rules either by creating a rule file and then adding your own rules to these. This is useful if you want to have best practice rules for enforcing certain naming conventions, for example. But you could also just point to a URL, and in this article I talked about that Microsoft provided. Let me just see if I can find the Power BI best practice analyzer. Yeah, I think it's this one actually. Let's see if I can put the link in the chat here. Yeah, so here Michael shares some of the rules that they use internally at Microsoft and how to load the rules into Tabular Editor and so on. So once you have the rules in there, Tabular Editor will scan your model continuously in the background to let you know if you have any issues that you should do something about. So, for example, one thing could be that we should not use the floating point data type. So the best practice analyzer here detected that I have a couple of columns that use a floating point data type, and this should probably be fixed to use the decimal or currency data type instead. And so that can be many different things. You also have this one that says I should not have any measures that contains the word to do, but I have this one. So if I double click on it, we see this is where we added to do before. And so you can have many different kinds of rules to inspect various things regarding your model. All right, I think this is, I want to also leave some time for questions, but I think I also covered most of the more important features of Tabular Editor from a Power BI Desktop perspective. And I see that there are 2 questions. The first is, can you explain how to use Tabular Editor for versioning? And this is a little more complicated topic, so I'd like to spend some time on that. So I mentioned earlier that the first thing you want to do is you want to use the save to folder functionality of Tabular Editor. But the thing is about that approach is that you will not be able to go back to Power BI Desktop. So let's say, for example, that now I take this model that I created using a combination of Power BI Desktop and Tabular Editor. And now I take this model and I save it to a folder structure. So let me just put a new folder here on my desktop. Let's create a new folder for that. And then we choose this. And now Tabular Editor is going to save the model metadata into this folder. So let me show you what this looks like on the disk here. So here we have the JSON file here called database.json, and then we have a list of all the tables. And within each table, we can see you have multiple files, one file for each of the measures in the model. And so this file structure is a very good file structure for putting all of the metadata into version control, so into Git or Subversion, for example. But the problem is that once you load the model metadata from this folder structure, you will not be able to go back to a Power BI desktop. So here I can open the folder structure using Tabular Editor. I can make changes. I can save the changes back to the folder structure, and I can also deploy the changes. But I can only deploy the changes to an instance of analysis services, Tabular, for example, or of course to the Power BI premium endpoint. So once I start to make changes to this folder structure, there's no way I can get the changes back into Power BI desktop. So if you decide you want to use Tabular Editor and you want to use the save to folder for versioning, well, then you have to be aware that now you're sort of leaving Power BI desktop for data modeling and relying only on Tabular Editor for creating your data model. And of course, it assumes that you also have access to the Power BI Premium XMLA endpoint so that you can actually deploy the model metadata as a data set. So this is sort of the limitation right now. Hopefully this is something that we will get a better solution for in the future. The reason why we can't go back to Power BI Desktop is because the PBIX file that Power BI uses contains a lot of other stuff other than just the data model. So the PBIX file also contains the definition of all of the reports, the report pages, the visuals that you have in the model. And these are not part of the tabular object model. So Tabular Editor cannot access, does not have access to any of the report visuals and doesn't know anything about the report visuals. So until Microsoft decides to provide a better file format for versioning the data, then I'm afraid that there's not a lot we can do to version the actual Power BI report itself. We can only version the data model. So I hope that answers your question, but it's a complicated topic. I have actually written a blog post on, if you go to tabulareditor.com and go to the blog, I actually wrote a longer blog article in multiple steps on how to use DevOps with Tabular Editor. And this is mostly focused for analysis services. But of course, if you have access to the Power BI Premium endpoint, then you can do the same thing as written in this blog post. Yeah, and Ricardo wrote that we had a long discussion with Wade last week about this. So yes, please keep putting pressure on Microsoft. Hopefully one day they will provide a better file format so we can better version everything regarding our Power BI reports and not just the data model. So someone asked a question about whether compatibility with Power BI Desktop for reporting services is granted, and I'm not sure I fully understand that question. I know that you can use, if you're using Power BI report server, then it should be possible to connect Tabular Editor directly to the Power BI report server and edit data sets that have already been deployed to the report server and deploy new data sets similar to how you would deploy it against the Power BI Premium endpoint. But other than that, I'm not really sure if I understand the question. So please, if you have more questions on this, then please rephrase it and let me know. And yeah, I think how much time do we have left on this call? I think it was just until 7:30, right?
Actually, we can go on for as long as you want, as we usually do, because our webinars usually last more than the scheduled time.
Okay.
I see that there is another question that just popped in. Someone is asking if it wouldn't be nice to be able to merge the folder data into the PBIX file.
Absolutely. Yeah, I fully agree. So that is sort of the dream scenario for me. Some of you, maybe if you already experimented a little bit with this, you know that you can actually take a PBIX file So for example, I have one here, and then you can actually unzip this file. So we can extract this, and then you will have this. And there's a lot of stuff going on here, something called metadata, something called data model, and so on. But the problem is that doing this is not supported by Microsoft. So there's no guarantee that if you modify any of this stuff, that it will work, and you may break your report. So we cannot really do this. But it really begs the question: is why does Microsoft not provide a file format that we can use for easy integration into version control? Hopefully we will get that someday, but at least for now, if you're on Power BI Premium or if you're using analysis services to host your data model, then you can certainly use the save to folder functionality, at least for versioning the data model instead. So,
if I can, Daniel, I have a question. I cannot see any details about the question from Anonymous for reporting services, but I have some experience on that. So I have a question for you regarding that. Maybe it's useful also for this for that person.
sure.
I've tried on our customer to connect Tabular Editor directly to a Power BI report server desktop that has the model inside, and more or less we are able to perform all the task that we can do with a standard Power BI desktop. But in that case, it was, if I remember well, October 2020 version, and as you know, there's a trimester release, no, quarterly release, or quarterly release of the Power BI Report Server Desktop. So it was October 2020, if I remember well, and I've been able to perform modifications on measures and more or less everything. But I had some strange behaviors after saving the file, and so we maybe the question was regarding that if there's a compatibility with that with Power BI Desktop for reporting services, or you are focused on Power BI Desktop.
Yeah, so I must admit that I haven't made any tests for the Power BI Report Server, and I think the main issue is that, as you also mentioned, that Power BI Report Server is always a few versions behind
Yes.
Power BI Desktop. So whenever there's some new features and new connectivity, we typically have to wait 2 or 3 months before we see those same features on the Power BI Report Server. But please, if you faced any specific issues while connecting to Power BI Report Server, please let me know on the GitHub site. I'll be happy to look into it. Maybe there's something I can do within Tabular Editor to make this work. So please. But again, the main thing about Tabular Editor is that regardless of whether you are connecting Tabular Editor to a Power BI Desktop, to on-premise analysis services, or Azure analysis services, or the Power BI service, or Power BI Report Server, all of these services that you can connect to, all of these are just different versions of analysis services, and Tabular Editor is just using the tabular object model, the TOM API, to connect. So oftentimes when something works with one of them, but it doesn't work with another one, then it's rare that I can make any change to Tabular Editor to make it work, because it's more likely that it's because of the different versions of analysis services. But hopefully over time, all of these products are going to more or less converge, so that we will have the same set of features that we can do regardless of which version of analysis services we are targeting.
Yes, I think you are right, because there are a lot of cases when we work with Power BI Report Server and Power BI Standard, and there are a lot of differences between them. And as long as there are more months between the release and the current date,
Yeah.
you are in trouble, because you are very far from that release. And in Power BI, that is very fast in releasing, bug fixing a new version. It's pretty important to have a very recent version, and in the Power BI report server, it's not always the case. So for sure, that was the reason for our problem. I hope it was this is useful also for the question that we had in the chat. Thank you very much. I don't know if there are any other questions, Alessandro.
No, I don't see any other question. So
okay,
I think so. Before we end, then if it's all right with you, maybe I show just a very short teaser of Tabular Editor.
I wanted to ask it, but I don't know if you had time. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
yes.
Sure, we can do that. So as I mentioned earlier, Tabular Editor 3 is going to be this new product, commercial product that is going to be released hopefully within 1 or 2 months. We are targeting right now April 1st for release. As you see here on the screen, this is how it looks like. It's a brand new product. It looks completely different than the old version of Tabular Editor. It has support for high DPI monitors, multi-monitor, where you can take various tool windows here and drag them over to different monitors to better align the layout with whatever workspace you have. And you can even change the theme to use a dark mode. I know some people have been asking for that also, so that's certainly possible here as well. And then it just has a bunch of really interesting new features. So one of the most popular things, or some of the stuff that most people have been asking for, is the ability to have intelligence when you're writing DAX expressions. So if I go to my expression editor here and start typing something, you can see that now Tabular Editor actually suggests different things that I could write. And it's actually a pretty intelligent intelligence engine that's running here. So if I type something like SumX, you can also see here it provides some more context on what I'm typing. Hang on, let me just fix my zoom in because I think it's zooming in a little too far here. So let's just put the magnification to 2. So here it tells you that now I'm writing SumX, so now it expects an iterator, so the table expression that we're going to sum. And so when I pop up the autocomplete here, it only suggests tables, for example, internet sales, products, and so on, but also table functions that return a table expression, add columns, calculate table, and so on. So for now, let's just add internet sales, or actually let me do another example. Let me use add columns and then put a table here like internet sales, and we add a new column called tests, and we put something here 1, 2, 3, and then you'll see now now that we're in the second argument to SumX, we're typing the expression and now it knows that we're inside a row context of the first table, and so the intelligence only suggests columns that are in this row context, including the test column that we added. So here's a lot of different stuff going on that it actually understands what we're typing here. We're getting a warning since we didn't fully qualify this column reference. So I'm going to put the internet sales here in front, so we should get rid of this one. But also notice how if I make a mistake, that it underlines where the error is, and I can even have multiple mistakes in my code, and it'll show all of these errors, so I know exactly what the issue is and how to fix it. I can also do stuff like putting all of this into a variable, return that variable plus something, and then we can do stuff like renaming the variable. So let's say now we want to call it hello, and it renames all of this, or if we want to see what the definition of this variable, or maybe if we have a measure references here and we want to see, okay, what is the definition of this measure? Oh, it looks like this. Okay, so a lot of stuff going on, and all in all, a much better DAX editing experience than what we had before. And hopefully this, or at least my goal with this, my vision is to sort of create the best possible DAX editor. Other than being able to edit the DAX expressions, we can also go in and write DAX queries. So we can write something like evaluate, summarize columns, and then product color. And now I want, let's say I want internet total sales, and maybe I want something like total freight, and then we can hit the execute button to actually view the results of these. We can also create a pivot table here where we can just drag in the measures, and we can slice by color, for example, and so we can see the values here. And we can even preview the data in the table itself. So if we right click on the table and choose preview data, we can view the contents of the table with infinite scrolling. And we are not restricted to doing that for just one table. We can have multiple of these preview tabs open. And if I have multiple monitors, I can drag one of them over to another monitor on another screen. So yeah, basically a lot of stuff we can do here. We can also create a diagram. So let's add internet sales to the diagram, and let's add all of the related tables to internet sales. Apply, auto arrange this. And so we start to get a better idea of how the model is visually structured, and we can edit the relationships between the tables. And so all in all, much better functionality for working with tabular models. And yeah, in my opinion, a real upgrade from the current version of Tabular Editor, a real premium experience for creating tabular models. If you want to know more about this tool, I created a 1-hour demo with Reed Havens, which is available on YouTube. You can just search for Tabular Editor 3, and there I go into much more details about all of these many new features that are here.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Daniel. It's been a great session. Very interesting, very useful, and thanks for showing your details. So for our users, if you need more information about this astonishing tool, you have all the details here. As always, we have recorded the session and we will put this on YouTube. So if you have to replay it, you can do it. Daniel will give us the slides, so you can also see again the slides. We will put them in our library. And I cannot see any further questions, so we can close the session here. And I would like to say thank you very much, Daniel. It's been a pleasure, big pleasure for us having you.